Hi, everyone. My name is Roberto Bosch, and I'm the president of the LGBTQ Canes Affinity Group. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment for us to pause and reflect on recent events. As some of you know, myself, our speaker, Chris Rackliffe, and many joining us today live in New York City, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in the US. Many lives have been lost, and many more lives have been changed forever. Our friends and new family in LA, Miami, and around the world have also experienced tremendous heartbreak and change. This week, we've also been gripped with outrage, injustice, and violence. We are summoned at this moment to reinforce our fundamental values, to call upon our resilience, and to be a force of healing the deep societal wounds that the death of George Floyd has torn open once more. We must do everything we can to address all instances of racial discrimination and abuse of power. Echoing what President Frank wrote on Sunday, I believe we at the U can take those emotions and turn them into a catalyst for change. That is what we do. We are more than just resilient. We are fierce, we are innovative, we're compassionate, and we strive to be exemplary. We can and we will do what we do best. We will bring people of vastly different backgrounds together. We will listen to new ideas and let scholarship and science guide us to purposeful action. Let's work together and create the change we need. We all believe that this moment does not call for silence. So speak up and speak out. Let people know how you feel and the changes you want. Before we get started, I also want to share that we have two upcoming virtual events. On June 19th, the Black Alumni Society will be hosting their Juneteenth celebrations. And on June 25th, we have another Cane conversation hosted by the DC Canes titled Inspiring Others Through Storytelling, which will take place at 6 p.m. Learn how to craft, adapt, and develop your storytelling skills. The event links will be shared with all the attendees, and I hope you can join us. And now, on behalf of the LGBTQ Canes, the New York and LA Canes communities, as well as the LGBTQ Student Center, I'd like to welcome you to what I believe will be an informative and very timely session with one of our very own alumni and a good friend of mine, Chris Rackliffe. We at the LGBTQ Canes Affinity Group have been working hard to develop ways to engage with and support our alumni across the various cities and graduation years. And for our first webinar, given the uncertain times we're all facing, the topic of change and how to embrace it seemed like an appropriate one. And Chris is the author of a book which deals on just that. So whether you're a recent grad, career changer, or simply part of the millions of us around the world who have had to adapt to a new normal, we hope that you'll take away some useful tips from today's session. This is meant to be an engaging session, so please feel free to use the Q&A function on your screen throughout the presentation. There will also be a Q&A session at the very end. We are one Canes family, and we couldn't put this event together alone. So before we begin, I'd like to thank the New York and LA Canes communities for helping us spread the word, and of course to Dr. Gisela Vega and her dedicated staff at the LGBTQ Student Center, whom we hope to partner with more programming with in the future. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Vega, she came to UM in early 2019 with over 25 years of higher education experience. Dr. Vega is passionate about learning and teaching and has served as a faculty member for the Women's and Gender Studies program at FIU, where she helped establish a queer studies certificate program. She's also a community leader and is a board member of the Aqua Foundation for Women and a member of the Miami Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. Just this past fall, Dr. Vega received a National Community Service Award from the National LGBTQ Task Force at its Miami Gala. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Vega, who will moderate today's session.
Thank you, Roberto. Before we begin today's interview, we wish to take a moment to acknowledge our South Florida lands, the traditional land of the Tequesta and Miccosukee people. Today, South Florida is still home to many indigenous people from across South Florida, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We acknowledge, recognize, and respect them as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous people and their traditional territories. To our Tequesta and Miccosukee people, we acknowledge you. As mentioned, I proudly serve as the director for our University of Miami's LGBTQ Student Center. The center is now in its 4th year, and as I like to say, it's the heart of our LGBTQIA+ community. We provide a holistic approach to educating and creating awareness around issues of gender, sexuality, and diversity, using restorative practices that transform the lives of our students and the greater LGBTQ plus community. We're located in the Witten University Center, and I encourage you all to follow us on our social media and check out our website. I am so happy to be with you all here today, and I'm excited to welcome home one of our very own proud Kane alum, Chris Rackliffe. Chris graduated from the University of Miami in 2009 with a Bachelor's of Science in Advertising and Psychology, and currently works at Aetna as their Director for the Social Media Engagement Strategies. Chris is an artist who paints with words, telling first-person stories that cut straight to the heart. You can read some of his work in Entertainment Weekly, Time, and Women's Health. He's an ardent storyteller, a seasoned blogger, and author of an ebook, 70 Life Lessons I Wish I'd Learned Sooner. In his new book, It's Good to See Me Again, How to Find Your Way When You Feel Lost, Chris digs deep, sharing his own biggest hurts and heartbreaks in an effort to demonstrate a single truth. Our relationship with change can define our entire lives. By introducing his EmbRACE model, he hopes to help anyone struggling with change to not only embrace it, but to reimagine that relationship that they have with it. Given the uncertainty we see in today's world, we selected as our topic for this webinar, Embrace Change and Find Your Way Forward, which seems to be serendipitous with Chris's book at the moment. So Chris, welcome back. I heard you were pretty involved here while you were at the U, so I thought a nice way to start today would be to have a little bit, perhaps about your most memorable moment while you were here at the U, and then share what influenced you in writing the book.
Absolutely. I just want to start by saying thank you for having me and that I'm grateful for this opportunity. There are so many great memories that I have from the University of Miami. I remember walking to class in flip-flops in the middle of February. I remember the Orange Bowl, going there for football games, but definitely the most memorable part of my U-Miami experience was being editor-in-chief of the IBIS yearbook my senior year, the 2008-2009 academic year. That experience really showed me that storytelling and helping not just tell my own story, but document the story of the university was something that really lit me up inside and showed what I was passionate about. It helped me find my purpose. It was at the end of putting that book together that I realized it wouldn't be the only book I did in my life and put out there into the world. So that was definitely life-changing for me.
So tell us a little bit about what influenced you in writing this particular book now, your new one that's coming out.
Yeah, it's Good to See Me Again started coming together roughly 3 years ago this month, in June 2017. I was laid off from my job at the time. I had a lucky streak, a very successful streak in the magazine industry, working at the time for Entertainment Weekly, running social media for them. When I got the news, it was disillusioning. It really threw me off course. I felt very lost. For the first time, I also had a lot of time on my hands. I had spent most of my adult life really pursuing my career and building momentum in that. And for the first time ever, I was sort of struggling at 30 years old. Didn't really know how to find my way forward, which I know a lot of people can relate to, especially now. For me, though, it really opened my eyes, and it demonstrated to me that it was part of a larger pattern, that it wasn't the first time I had felt lost in my life. Obviously, I lost my job, but I had lost many things over the years and felt lost too. And it made me start to unpack the reasons why I felt that way. Why did I feel lost? Why was my job such a big part of my identity? Why what ultimately was driving this feeling of feeling lost. The subtitle for It's Good to See Me Again is How to Find Your Way When You Feel Lost. I know the webinar session is about how to find your way forward. They're basically the same thing. For me, I realized that I was feeling lost because I didn't know how to tolerate change. And it was in the unpacking of that pattern that I realized over time that I had a really terrible relationship with change, that I resisted again and again and again, by denying or numbing or running away from it, avoiding change whenever it arose. If I didn't like how it was, I wasn't going to deal with it. There are several problems with that approach. We'll get into that when we talk about the race model. I think for now, though, what's important is that people know that when you feel lost, you're not actually really lost. It's a misnomer. There are two quotes that actually inspired the beginning of this book. The first has to do with change, and it's from President John F. Kennedy. He said, "For time and the world do not stand still. Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future." There was another quote that I came across when I was doing research that really struck me, and it was from Eckhart Tolle, who is a spiritual and self-help author. He wrote, "How can I lose something that I am? It is impossible." And those two things together helped me realize that I hadn't actually lost my way. I just felt that way. And it was because I was resisting change. If change is the law of life and you resist the law of life, then you're resisting something that you have no power resisting. And ultimately, it was in building this model that I realized how to find my way back, how to stop feeling lost.
Understood. Yes. I think so many people resonate with what you've shared, the experiences that you've had. For folks right now, this is such a difficult time. And as I said, I think it's really timely for us to be having this discussion. In the book, you introduce your EmbRACE model. It focuses on 4 different aspects of recognizing and moving through change. You talk about resisting it, accepting it, choosing it, and embracing change. Obviously a lengthy journey, one that you've shared, part of your journey that you've been on. So let's start with you sort of helping us understand. I know you've mentioned it briefly, but resisting change. How do we begin? How does that all get sort of put into place?
Yeah, so resistance, I found in unpacking my own resistance throughout my life. Resistance is really one thing. It is resisting what reality is. It's trying to make reality something other than what it is. You try to make one moment other into something that it's not. You can't accept the way things actually are. Resistance comes to fruition in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's through numbing. So people will turn to substances. Sometimes it's innocent, like a glass of wine after a rough day. Sometimes it's far worse, like a drug dependency or substance abuse of any kind. There are other ways that we resist change. In the resistance section, I talk about one of my most painful memories, which is the death of my mom, which also happened when I was at UMiami between fall and spring semesters my freshman year. I resisted her death by just simply not going to the funeral. I couldn't come to terms with the loss. I felt disillusioned, depressed, and disempowered. I just really didn't know how to deal with it. That's obviously an extreme example, but resistance shows up in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different contexts. Ultimately, though, it has to do with not wanting things to be the way that they are. And so for me, I really tried to unpack almost in like a here's what not to do kind of way in the resistance section in my book. All the different ways that I resisted. Resistance is not, it's normal. It's a normal reaction to not want things to change. I actually talk about 3 reasons why we resist in the book, which are we want to preserve feeling good, we want to prevent feeling bad, or we want to do a combination of both. So ultimately, every form of resistance boils down to that. It's not necessarily the fact that we reach for a substitute of experiencing. It's not necessarily what we substitute. It's that we look to substitute the experience of change to begin with. It's in the turning away from reality that is the crux of the problem.
I totally understand where you're coming from, and you're absolutely right. That whole resistance to change piece. Thank you for sharing. Sharing about your mom. Having lost my own mother, I can completely relate to what you just shared regarding that whole aspect of us wanting to resist change. So, Chris, thinking about that, then, how do we move from resisting it to that next step that you talk about in your model?
Yeah, the next step in the process is acceptance. This is probably the most difficult part of the journey. I would say the first step is recognizing that you're resisting in the first place. In the beginning of the acceptance section, I quote the Serenity Prayer, which is, God grant me the clarity to know the things that I can't change, to recognize the things that I can, and to know, to have the wisdom to know the difference. So that really, to me, is what helped me identify that I only really have two choices in life. We only really have two choices in life. We can either accept the things that cannot change, or we can choose to change the rest. So in the acceptance section, I talk about the work that we do to accept. There are several forms of acceptance that I go through. One is forgiveness. Acceptance is coming to terms with something that's already happened. So it's past oriented. In the end, it's learning to accept what has come to pass so that you can move forward. For me, there were several other exercises beyond forgiveness. One of them was letter writing. So another thing that I resisted coming to terms with was the fact that I had a boyfriend who cheated on me. But one of the more beautiful moments of reconciliation that happened in my life was he sent me a letter about a month after we broke up. And I talk in a chapter in the book called The Four Letters. This is the first letter. And in that letter, he opened up his heart to me and told me, ironically, to never change who I was, but that he really felt that I would have an impact on him for the rest of his life. And that, to me, was such a moment of grace and kindness that it shocked me out of my own resistance in telling myself stories that I was never going to find anyone better, that it was all my fault. I talk a lot in the book about the stories that we tell ourselves. Ultimately, in our resistance of change and of reality, we end up telling ourselves how terrible things are, how they should have been different. These stories are ultimately where we need to focus our work. So throughout the rest of the model, I challenge our stories. In accepting and in letter writing, it's coming to terms with the stories that I had told myself. The first letter I wrote after he wrote his to me was a letter to myself, actually. I wrote a love letter to myself for the first time in my life. It sounds crazy or maybe trivial. It really was transformative for me. To express those things about myself that I most valued, but also felt were some of my biggest disadvantages, really helped me to see that they weren't disadvantages at all, that I was just telling myself, you're too sensitive, you're too needy. All of the various forms of stories that we tell ourselves to have a negative dialogue with ourselves. It brings it out into the light. And in that letter, it was shining a light on all of the positive things about myself. I also wrote a letter to my mom. You know, we talked about how she died when I was a freshman at UM. It took me years, almost 12 years, to come to terms with her death. But ultimately, it was in saying goodbye and allowing myself to give myself the closure I didn't allow myself to have before because I didn't go to her funeral. That was also transformative for me. There was another letter that I wrote as well that completed the journey. Ultimately, there are several other ways too that we can come to terms with reality or accept. There's a beautiful practice in ancient Hawaiian culture called Ho'oponopono that is fascinating to me, and I write about it in the book as well. It's a 4-step reconciliation process that was traditionally meant to unfold in place in person between two people who felt were wronged in a situation. Ultimately, their families would gather together and they would go through the 4 steps, which are, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you, or I see you, which is really the same thing. It's in following those 4 steps that we see that even when we wrong someone else or we feel wronged, that we can find closure. This chapter in particular actually is really impactful because I recommend that people turn inward to find the closure that they might not ever get by turning outward. You might never get an apology. You might never hear from someone again that breaks up with you. If you lose your job, you're dealt a lot of different emotions, right? And so you have to come to terms with them. Ultimately, I recommend people doing this in their mind's eye and using the power of visualization to go through the steps, because you might not be able to find that closure from someone. And ultimately, it's a gift you give yourself. Acceptance is a gift you give yourself. It comes in many different forms. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It's not about the other person at all. It's about releasing the resentment within and remembering differently. In the book, I actually call forgiveness, or I speak about forgiveness as singing the same song, but in the proper tune or the proper key. So it's raising up the vibration from something that is negative, something that you couldn't have fathomed you would ever go through or ever get over, to something that actually helps you. And that leads to the final part of accepting, which is gratitude. Finding little bits of joy or growth in the things that we feel break us, but actually make us, are what life is all about. I mean, learning to see things differently, changing your perspective on it, is ultimately how we do find acceptance and how we move forward from resistance.
Those are great tips. I think of letter writing, and it's an art that we hardly use anymore, but you're absolutely right. It can be so powerful and profound, yet we don't take the time to do it. So those are some great tips. I know there's some other ones that you also have in the book, but these are some great ones to get us to start thinking about acceptance and how we go through that process of the model. So how do you choose to change them? Like what is it that, creates that decision to say, okay, I'm ready to move forward?
Yeah, good question. Choosing is probably one of the most empowering parts of the book, because ultimately I talk a lot about our free will, our God-given right to choose. I believe, it's my thesis in the book, that part of the reason why we feel so lost is because we feel like there's not another choice. We feel like, if I lose my job, then what am I going to do? We, again, tell ourselves stories. I'm never going to find another job. I've peaked. There isn't something better or someone better out there for me. Choosing to change is all about reclaiming your power to choose. It's remembering that you can't change the past, so it must be accepted, but you can change everything else. So it's reclaiming that power. There are 2 areas, I call them centers of gravity in the book, where we can ultimately wield our power to choose. The first is in our inner world. These choices have to do with our thoughts, our emotions, and challenging those stories that I mentioned. So one of the great and powerful exercises in the choosing section has to do with the inner world, and it's in rewriting our stories. So if you're telling yourself a story, let's just say you've lost your job recently, or maybe you're trying to figure out how to get your career started to begin with. You might be thinking, I'm never going to find a job. The economy is too rough right now. What if I run out of money? All of those are natural reactions. They are forms of resistance of reality. They don't actually exist. You make them up in your mind. But if you follow these steps, you can help to challenge yourself and bring your awareness to your negative thought patterns. So there are, I think, 6 steps. I'll go through them now. The first is you ask yourself, is that true? We don't ever really stop to ask ourselves, is this story I'm telling myself actually true? This starts to help us unpack the story and see it for what it actually is. The second question is that absolutely true? So we raise it up a level where we can say, is that objectively true? Is it universally true? And even if we think it might be true from the outset, we start to see, we might be able to poke holes in this story, right? From there, we can ask ourselves, how do I feel when I believe this thought, this story? Oftentimes, it's that we don't feel good at all. It feels really bad, really painful. And ultimately, it has to do, again, with resisting reality. The next question, the next step is, who would I be without this thought? So this starts to help us see, what if I gave up thinking in this way? What if I didn't tell myself this story? How would things be then? The next step is, what's the opposite of this thought? Typically, the thought or the story that we're choosing to believe in, which is disempowering us, is the exact opposite of what reality is. So we can start to see, actually, I don't know that I'm never going to find another job. That is obviously jumping to conclusions, a cognitive distortion. We can start to see the truth. And ultimately, that's what getting in touch with your inner world is all about. Unpacking the negativity that you've chosen to believe in and challenging it instead, choosing to change what you believe in. That leaves our outer orbit. So that's our other center of gravity. In my life and in the book, I talk about a couple of different ways that I did this. One way was to really think about the people that I allowed in my life. The people that you surround yourself with have a disproportionate impact on your life and on who you think you are. So I call it my circle of trust. And there's a chapter by the same name in the book. But it's ultimately about carefully selecting. I call it consciously choosing. You consciously choose the people with whom you surround yourself. And you really think very hard about the people that you date, the people you spend time with, and the investments you're making in your surroundings. So ultimately, I talk about how our investments should pay dividends, right? We should earn on our investments. They should give us a return. We should feel empowered. We should feel supported. Even when we resist and even when we tell ourselves negative stories, it's our outer orbit that mirrors us back to ourselves and helps us see that actually I can find something and I do have the power to create my own reality. And it's in these two areas where we start to see that actually if I focus my energy that I was spending resisting on actually choosing the things that I have control over, then I can find actual peace.
You know, you talk about this whole idea of rewriting our narrative and understanding the narrative that we have. And sometimes we're our own worst enemy when it comes to that, right? And that's the biggest piece that we sort of resists. You know, we're not able to create that change that we're looking for. So I hear you loud and clear. And I know a lot of people out there that are listening, that this is resonating with a lot of folks. So now that we've talked a little bit about, you know, how do you choose to change? How do we get to that next step in the model?
Yes, so the final step is to embrace change when it arises in the future. Now that you know that all of these, whether you're telling yourself stories or numbing or avoiding or denying, they're all forms of resistance. Ultimately, you can see that when it starts to arise in the future, you can do something else instead, and you can choose to embrace it. This section in the book is, it taps into really powerful principles that help me personally. One is what I call the concept of heart birth. So everybody knows about heartbreak, right? Everybody's had their heart broken in one way or another. And in fact, it is only through change that we feel our hearts break. I, in the book, talk about, it's not actually heartbreak, it's heart birth. It's birthing new levels within you and helping you to grow. So it just is a change of reference. Again, that's ultimately what we're trying to do here, is to say, you know what? I can't change this. There's nothing I can do about it. The quicker I get to acceptance, the more quickly I can focus on everything that's under my control, right? It's in recognizing our heartbreaks as heart births that we can see, you know what? This is an ending, and that's okay. A chapter is coming to a close, but that also means that another chapter is starting, and a beginning is also starting. You're taking another foot forward, and you don't know where things lead, and that can be really scary. But ultimately, it's in the confidence and the faith and the trust that you're being led in the right direction. In the embracing section, I call it that life is unfolding for you and not happening to you. This is a really important distinction that we need to make, right? When I think that life sucks, why does this keep happening to me? Again, those internal dialogues, those stories we tell ourselves, we break ourselves down instead of building ourselves up. But if we challenge that instead and say, you know what? Yes, it happened. Yes, it sucked. And I survived. Yes, it hurt. And I healed. Yes, and is actually something I talk about in the acceptance section as well. I think it's really powerful to say, you know what? This hurt and it sucked. But I also made it through to brighter days. And I learned and I grew. These are all ways that we can help to challenge our perspective. Another really powerful one that helps me personally, and yes, I still resist all the time. I still tell myself negative thoughts, I'm not immune to them. This model is a framework for finding your way back. It's not a way for being perfect, that's for sure. We're all human, and we all resist feeling our feelings and resist change. This principle I call the equal or better principle. And it is as follows. Even if it's hard as hell, even if it looks nothing like you imagined it would, even if it takes longer than you expect, you're always guided to something better because you're granted the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to heal. So if you focus on learning, you can never fail. You know, a lot of times we are quick to jump to the conclusion that just because something has changed or we didn't know or we don't know what to do about what has happened, that we're a failure and that we didn't prepare enough. Ultimately, equal or better is about recognizing that you've survived every single challenge you've ever been through. Everyone on this Zoom has survived 100% of their worst days. So you are always led to, at the bare minimum, equal to where you are, but most often better than where you are. So it's just about reframing and recognizing that, you know what, it's hard, it's really hard right now, but it's not always going to be this way. Change is the law of life. Change is the impetus of the entire universe. It was born with the Big Bang. It is the only way that we experience life. Life is experienced only through change. If things didn't change, there would be nothing to sense. There would be nothing to experience at all if things remain the same. So change is the same as life. So in embracing it, we realize, actually, I'm being guided to something better. Oftentimes, what we think is rejection is really just a redirection to a path that gets us to a better destination than where we would have gotten to if we had been able to control all the variables.
I love the embrace part of this role, this model. I love the concept of heart birth. I think it's a beautiful concept. I think it's a great new way to think about how we look at heartbreak. And you're absolutely right. You know, change is the only thing that's constant in life. So how we choose to deal with it will certainly, you know, help us move forward. So, you know, as I hear your model and I hear about your book, which I'm super excited, I can't wait to be able to get my hands on it. But in our world, you know, I'm working with students every day, and our students, they're struggling. You know, we have everything from our seniors who have just graduated and are struggling to finding jobs, to our returning students who are kind of tired of the online Zoom classes and don't know what the future is holding for them in terms of the next year. And then we have incoming first year students who are filled with a ton of uncertainty. So tell us, Chris, what advice would you give to a current student or a graduated student or alumni that might be struggling at this moment?
Great question. And I think this will help a lot of people. There are several steps that I would recommend taking. The first is to allow yourself to feel however it is that you feel. If you are feeling angry, if you are feeling sad, if you're feeling disillusioned, allow yourself to feel it. Resisting is also about resisting our emotions. So typically we don't allow ourselves to feel hurt. We don't want to feel angry, but it's in allowing ourselves to feel the emotions that they pass. So if you're frustrated that you have 8 different Zoom calls happening, right? And whether it's from a work standpoint or a class standpoint, you know, you are able to recognize, I think, that, you know what, I'm telling myself that this sucks, and it's because it might suck in some ways, and I feel disconnected, I feel disempowered, but ultimately that's also okay, because that's a normal reaction to things changing. So allow yourself to feel, is allowing yourself to just feel whatever comes up is super, super important. The next thing is to recognize anything that you cannot change. One of those things might be recognizing that Zoom meetings aren't going anywhere. Whether it's you've graduated and you're about to enter the workforce, I can tell you firsthand that it's not going to change. Zoom is a tool that's empowering companies to stay connected to. Ultimately, it's a tool to stay connected. So if you change your frame of reference to say, you know what, this isn't the same as an in-person class or meeting, but I'm going to try to make the most of it. That is a really important distinction, and something that can help you say, I've spent so much energy resisting that this is happening that I haven't actually been able to make the most of it. So call out your resistance and also recognize the things that you can't change. Then focus on all of the things that you can. You can change how you relate to it. You can change your self-care practice or taking care of your inner world, right? Meditation, gratitude, really centering ourselves, taking extra time to be compassionate with yourself and others during times of extreme change, like what we're going through right now, which you could even call trauma. Really sitting with yourself and allowing whatever comes up is so, 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 so important. And cultivating a better relationship with your inner world will help you feel calmer and help you see that, you know what, if I actually spend the energy and the time that I was spending resisting Zoom or reality, that I can choose to tune out of social media or drink more water instead of getting drunk every night on wine or doing happy hours. Really getting very careful about the choices that you make, because ultimately that's what defines our lives, is the choices that we make. So I would say just remember that you can't change certain things, and that's okay. And it's okay to feel a certain way about that. But once you've come to terms with it, then choose to change the things that you can. And once change comes up again in the future, and you resist, which is natural, say, I'm resisting, and that's okay. I'm going to allow myself the time to process this and figure out what I can do next that is actually under my control.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. So actually at this point, we're going to open up the segment of the webinar to answer your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it down in the question box below. We'll try to answer all questions today. However, if we run out of time, we'll be sure to send questions and answers to all participants after the webinar. So here we have our first question. It's kind of a long one, but let me go ahead and send it your way, Chris. Here it is. This person shares with us that they're interested in dealing with changes that seem to vacillate between progression and regression. I don't think I have a hard time adapting to change, but I find it frustrating and disheartening at times to feel like reality is continuously in flux and that I have no control. For example, in this moment, I'm finding it hard to reconcile myself with change as it relates to navigating through our structurally and systemically racist society, where I don't have the ability to just accept change. How do we find restoration in dealing with changes that happen as a result of seeming progress, while also dealing with the changes that happen to continue to uphold the failures of our past as a society? It's a lot.
Wonderful question. And it actually brings up a really good point that I want to make. So when I developed the model, the RACE model for change, I did so because I thought that it would be a really good, easy to remember acronym. However, obviously, it begs the question of race and racism, and that's a very timely topic right now. I do want to be clear that fighting injustice is fighting for change, not against change. I hear the question in that progress is a slow journey, and sometimes it means 5 steps forward and 6 steps back, or 2 and then 1. Change is also not linear, and neither is healing. And so I think it's really important to remember that, you know what, this is really hard, and that's okay. I sensed a little bit of resistance in the question itself, which is that you don't want to accept that the path is winding and the path is long. That's hard. That's really difficult to do. But the sooner you come to terms with the fact that I'm going to play my part and that's all you need to focus on, ultimately, all you can control is the choices that you make. So that is a really empowering thought to have and a realization. Because if you're only thinking about how are we going to solve this problem as a society and how are we going to change the systems that uphold injustice in this country, it's really easy to feel weighed down and like it's not possible to create the change that we all know is necessary. The reality is, once you start to lift yourself up and see, look at how far we've come. It's really hard to see right now, but we have made a lot of progress. It has been slow, it has been winding, and it will continue to be that way because that's how democracy works. And Lord knows there's a lot of healing that has to happen along the way. I have come to terms with the fact that I'm going to likely spend the rest of my life trying to explain to white people why this is a problem. And ultimately, racism is a white person problem. That's my duty. It's our individual duty to recognize the change that we can affect on our own and solely focus on that. I think that is a really empowering reminder and something that helps to bring us back down to earth and realize that I don't have to fight society, I just have to step up myself.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's a difficult question, and clearly there's a lot that needs to, a lot of change that needs to happen in society right now.
I can guarantee you it's gonna come, change gonna come, as they say. That's the law of life.
I agree, I agree. Let me go to another question here. We have, Let's see, someone who wrote in asks, how does someone help a family member or friend work through their resistance to change? And second part to that is, what does support through the race model look like?
Okay, let's unpack the first question first. So it's about recognizing someone else's resistance.
Right. Helping
Okay.
a family member or friend work through their resistance to change.
Okay. So this is actually a really great question, because we don't like to know that we're resisting. We resist our own resistance, which is why the first step is resist one thing only, our resistance to change. I think the biggest thing you can do is just be curious and compassionate with someone. Instead of saying, you're resisting, you're avoiding, you're denying, no one wants to hear that. They're going to deny that they're in denial. That's the whole point of being in denial. I would say, try to challenge the story. Say, it sounds like you're telling yourself this, or the way that this is coming across to me is XYZ. It's also important to stay focused on yourself and how you're interpreting it, because you could also be wrong. You don't know where they might be at on their journey. So remaining curious and open is really, really important. That way you can try to understand their position and where they're at. So asking questions instead of saying, you're resisting and you need to do XYZ, no one's going to respond very well to that. I think it's just being curious. It's asking open-ended questions to say, you know what, I know that this happened lately. How are you feeling about that? Allow them to talk about how they're feeling. Try to focus them on getting to the feeling. Again, because oftentimes we don't allow ourselves to feel angry or upset. And that is too a resistance of reality, and a reaction to change. So I think you can also, and this goes to the second, I think, question, which was more about how do you support someone through the model?
Mm-hmm.
You can offer up, if they would like you to, and I do this too with friends and family members all the time. I say, you know what, it sounds like this is a really frustrating time for you. Have you thought about trying XYZ? It really helps me when I'm going through something similar. So a good example is gratitude. Gratitude is accessible to anyone, anywhere, at any time. And it's a reframing of, things from a negative light to a positive light. So I think, encouraging people, asking them, well, I know that this is hard, but what's one way that this could maybe turn out for the better for you? That's a way to help them start to get to acceptance and to say, you know what, this sucks. Yes, it sucks, and I will get past it. And I think encouraging them to do the self-work, to remember that our inner world is our responsibility, is a really important reminder for people, not just for ourselves, but reminding people, you know what, I know that what you're going through is really hard and it sounds heartbreaking, but there might also be another way to look at this. And I am here to support you no matter what. You can't force anything on someone, but I think just reminding them that you're there is really important, and opening up the door to say, I have a lot of tools that work for me, or I read XYZ book. It doesn't have to be mine, of course, but thinking through tools that you've used that have worked and offering them up, or saying, hey, if you're open to it, I'm willing to share these. That's also really important. I wouldn't ever say to someone, you need to accept this because it's not going to change. Everyone has their own journey with grief, for instance. And it's really important to just honor wherever they're at and say, it's okay to feel however you're feeling. When you're ready, just know that I have exercises in forgiveness, which are in my book, or that I've really found this meditation really helpful. maybe you might want to give it a try. And they might say no. They might not want the help, and that's also okay. But I think just in offering to be there and opening the door and saying, this worked for me, if you're willing to consider it, then I'd be willing to share it.
That's great. We have so many questions that have come in and only a little bit of time left. So we're looking at a good one to kind of close out with before we move on. So Chris, this is Deborah Ramos saying hi. Used to work with you at the SOC, and remember going into the IBIS workroom and seeing you working late blasting Mariah Carey. Okay, Mariah Carey. Let's see. So one of the questions we get to here is, what are some effective ways to get more comfortable with change itself?
Okay, some ways to get comfortable with accepting change. The first is to just be open to acceptance. Many people aren't. We stay stuck in resistance for years and years and years. I know because I've been there and I've done it. I've wallowed in relationships that ended. I talked about grieving my mom's death for a while, a long time. But it's in the opening ourselves up to acceptance that we can actually start to accept. I also find forgiveness really powerful. You will find conflicting advice about this from different self-help authors. I want to be honest about that. Some authors and some experts say you don't have to forgive. I don't operate in that school of thought because I believe that forgiveness is for ourselves, to release the resentments that we have for the way things worked out. So forgiveness is one area of opportunity, I think, for people to forgive the past, to forgive someone's wrongdoings, to forgive ourselves for the mistakes that we've made. That is so powerful. And honestly, one of the people I struggled to forgive the most was myself. I had to do a lot of work internally to come to terms with what I thought were big mistakes, detours that actually I perceived as obstacles, but were the way for me. So forgiveness is one, gratitude is another. I've talked about that already. I do want to talk about grace. So grace and faith for me have been transformative, especially over the last 3 to 5 years. I've really leaned very heavily on my faith. I recognize that not everyone might be open to that, and that different people have different, views religiously. Religion aside, I think just believing, regardless of what you want to call it, that you're being guided to something better is really empowering and allows us to say, you know what, I can accept this because I know that better things are on the horizon, and that this hurts, but I will heal from this and I will bounce back. It's in telling ourselves a different story, rewriting the negativity internally, calling it out, expressing ourselves. That's how we do the work to accept. I hope that answered the question.
I think that's great. And that's actually, I think, the perfect note for us to end our discussion today, our interview. Chris, thank you so much. We definitely appreciate you being here. As I said, we have a lot of questions that came in. We will get back to you with all those other questions. Thank you, family and friends, for joining us today. I want to give a special thanks and shout out to Roberto Bosch and Carol Shipman from the Alumni Association for inviting me to moderate this session today. Chris, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, getting to know you and hearing about your fabulous and timely book, very timely. So thank you for all that. With that, I turn it back over to Roberto.
Thanks, Dr. Vega, for moderating. And thank you, Chris, for sharing your insights and obviously your personal experience. As we come to a close, I'd like to remind everyone that the LGBTQ Canes and the numerous Canes communities, special interest groups, and affinity groups are here for you. We appreciate all your feedback. And of course, we welcome all of your ideas on how best we could serve you. So if you're a recent alum, or if you're a student returning to or visiting one of the many cities we're located in, please get in contact with us. And if you happen to find yourself at our beautiful campus this fall, please reach out to the LGBTQ Center and pay them a visit.